I love a good cheesy acronym, OARS. Observe, affirm, report, support. Paddle to safety. Like, grab your oars, listen without judgment. Affirm. A lot of times traffickers are said, if they ask you a question, it's because nobody believes you, right? And growing up, when we want to solve a problem, what do? We gather all the information we can. How do we gather that information? We ask questions. Traffickers and exploiters often count on that. And they're like, well, if they ask you questions, because they don't believe you. So when somebody's like, hey, I think something bad happened to me, or something's making me really uncomfortable, or I think I might be trafficked, or I think I might be, something's wrong. Very rarely does somebody use the language, I've been trafficked, or identify as a victim. I've had many people where it's like, have you been trafficked? No. Oh, have you been in the life? Oh yeah, I've been in the life for 4 years. So it's that language and terminology. But like, hey, I think something's off. And if you're like, what happened? When did that happen? What's going on? Because you want to learn and understand. First thing they hear is they're asking me a question. They don't believe me. So when you listen, affirm. I believe you. Thank you for trusting me with your story. You did the right thing by coming forward. I'm with you in this. You don't have to face this alone.
Welcome back to On the Line. Today, we've got just an amazing episode. We sit down with Ashley Moore, who is extraordinarily articulate and has just a ton of information on sexual exploitation, sexual trafficking, some of the issues with the porn industry and how this affects all of this different stuff. This was a very eye-opening interview. So I hope you enjoy it. If you think this is important, please share it, like this video, help get this message out. And also one other thing, if you have follow-up questions, because we get into a lot of different topics with this, particularly how parents can watch out for signs with their kids, how the church community and school community can watch out for these types of things taking place in the school. If you have any particular questions, please leave those comments in the comment section. And what we can do is we can bring Ashley back on and she can answer some of those specific questions that you might have. So very blessed to have Ashley on. We hope you enjoy the interview. As always, God bless. All right. And Sir Bennett says we're live. Ashley, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Thanks for making the long trek in.
Road trips are worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm excited. You've got some, I think, very important things to talk about. I think our audience is going to be very interested in it. Before we kind of dive into the topic, can you just tell us a little bit just who you are, what your background is, and kind of why you're passionate about what we're going to talk about, exploitation and sexual trafficking and all these different things?
Absolutely. Yes. So my name is Ashley Moore. I'm the executive director of CAST, Citizens Against Sex Trafficking. I've been in the anti-trafficking movement for just under 10 years. I started off, for me, I grew up in suburban Woodbury, Minnesota, where this issue wasn't really on the radar for people. And I didn't really learn about the issue of human trafficking until I got to a college class, which learning about it in a classroom felt a little anticlimactic, seeing as that's my entire career path now. But it kickstarted this journey for me. And so 10 years in, I started as a caseworker working with survivors of sex trafficking in Vienna, Austria, Sheffield, England. Here in the States, I've partnered with law enforcement on freedom flight and sting operations. I now focus in on the prevention side. Academically, I have my master's degree in International Criminology with a focus on restorative justice. So how do we bring healing and reconciliation into the justice system? And for me, I just want to invite community members into this space in a way that is victim-centered, trauma-informed prevention. And so really listening and learning from victim survivor experts in this space who have lived experience, who can really give guidance and invite people to care about this issue, to understand that it's happening in our backyard, and what can each of us do to end it before it begins, because it is so prevalent here.
So how prevalent is it? Do you think that most people underestimate or overestimate kind of the danger of this industry?
I think when people think about the issue of sex trafficking, they think it's an issue over there. You hear or see movies like Taken or The Sound of Freedom, where it's depicted in different locations outside of the United States. And so for a lot of Americans, it's like, oh, it's different country, different state, different city. It's not in my local community. And the reality is that it is everywhere. And law enforcement has shared too that the human trafficking and human exploitation is going to surpass the drug trade in the next 5 to 10 years. And so it
Wow.
is very prevalent. It happens in our backyard, and it happens so much more than we think it does. And so I think people often underestimate what trafficking and exploitation are because they don't fully understand what it truly is. So they don't think, oh, that happens right here.
hmm So this is something you said it's kind of, in 5 years, it's going to surpass which, I mean, the drug trade is
Mhm.
just, I mean, that's astronomical, right?
Right.
So is this something like 40 years ago? Was this much lower? Is this something that's just been on kind of a hyper uptrend, or is this kind of just always been there in the US?
It's oftentimes they say that it's one of the oldest professions,
Yeah.
the oldest oppression. And so human exploitation has been around for millennia, but it is something that with technology and with more people on this planet than ever before, more exploitation than ever before.
Mm.
It's so much more prevalent than we think it is. It's happening so much more, and it's been on the rise. I think with technology that has kickstart and jumped that conversation significantly more than we thought.
So what are some of the ways that this plays out? So for someone that's, maybe they've seen Sound of Freedom, or, maybe they've seen Taken, they might have kind of a very loose grasp, but like, so what's the landscape of this kind of dark industry? How would we begin to understand that?
Right. I think first and foremost, let's start with the definition of what is human trafficking, what is human exploitation. And for me, my area of expertise is in sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. That's my area of focus.
hmm
In the US, when you think of human trafficking, there's often labor or sex trafficking. So as I talk about this, it'll be in the context of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation.
Okay. So what's labor trafficking? Just so I can.
Yeah. So labor trafficking is when somebody is forced to work without proper compensation.
Mm.
And so for either no or proper compensation.
Okay.
Yeah. And so for what exploitation is, it's one of those terms that you hear about it and you're like, oh, yeah, I know what it is. But when I give presentations, oftentimes I'm like, how many of you in one sentence can give a clear definition of what exploitation is or sexual exploitation? I've had one student once out of 11,000 people we've reached so far who have been able to give a clear answer.
I don't think I could give a clear answer, to be honest. But by the end of this, I'm going to be able to.
Yeah. And so what sexual exploitation is, there's a lot of different definitions. How CAST has kind of synthesized that has been causing harm sexually for gain. It is causing harm sexually for gain is the umbrella term.
Mm.
And it includes so many different facets to it. And so it includes sex trafficking, which is there's an acts, a means, a purpose. And I'll dive into what sex trafficking looks like a little bit more in a moment. All of sex trafficking is a form of sexual exploitation, but sexual exploitation is so much bigger and broader than sex trafficking.
Okay. I remember you said this earlier. I thought that kind of stuck with me, right? So exploitation is something that's going to be quite common. You can define what you mean by common, but it's going to be much more common. And then sometimes it manifests as sex trafficking.
Correct.
Right. And from my perception, people usually think of sex trafficking, but they might not be really thinking about sexual exploitation. Do you think that's correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Spot on. And things that also fall under sexual exploitation that are on the rise is things like sextortion, which is blackmail over sexualized content. We have things like survival sex, which is trading your body for basic needs.
Mm.
It's sugaring, which is trading your body for luxury items. So you might hear the phrase like sugar mommy or sugar daddy.
Mm-hmm.
That's another form of exploitation, especially for minors. And there's sexual violence, sexual harassment, sexual abuse. There's all these different things that are causing harm sexually for gain. And when we say gain, that could be tangible, like for money or drugs or some form of wealth, but it could also be intangible gain, like power or control or popularity. And so when we're thinking through exploitation, causing harm sexually for gain, thinking of it in a bit of a broader sense than somebody causing sexual harm to somebody else for money or for drugs or for wealth in that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And so what sex trafficking is sex trafficking is a commercial sex act that has to have three elements. There must be an act, a means, and a purpose.
Mm.
And for the act, it could be harboring, so keeping somebody. It could be transporting, which I think a lot of people think of human smuggling when they think of trafficking, where, oh, they're brought from a different country to this location for the purpose of sexual exploitation or sexual favors or sexual acts. It can be that, but it is also, you can be trafficked from your own home. And so it could be the harboring, the receipt of persons, the recruitment, the transporting. There's so many elements of that acts that can take place. Acts and then means would be, for certain states like Minnesota, it's by any means. For other states, they have certain requirements of what means, whether it's force, fraud, or coercion. So you're forcing somebody, whether it's physical or not, threat or deception. And then for the purpose is commercial sex act, trading a sexual favor for something of value, both tangible, potentially intangible.
So what's the best way to go about it? Should we dive into sex trafficking or should we start with exploitation? What would be a better route? We should certainly kind of dive into both.
I can kind of touch base on both of them. So really for the sexual exploitation piece, oftentimes like at CAST, our mission is to empower our community to end sexual exploitation. Our name is Citizens Against Sex Trafficking. Probably if we restart the organization, we would have called it CASE, Citizens Against Sexual Exploitation, to include that full umbrella term. But I think talking about what we're seeing in our local community and in the United States, that might be kind of a good starting point, and we can make some distinctions between the two, if that's helpful. For sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, I've mentioned before, it's on the rise. And some of the local statistics and some of the statistics nationwide. Right now, human trafficking is the second largest criminal enterprise. It's expected to be on the rise. Right now, it's behind the drug trade. It's expected to surpass the drug trade in the next 5 to 10 years. It's something where the average age of entry into sex trafficking in the Twin Cities in Minnesota is between 11 and 14 years old.
Oh, gosh.
Introduction into sexual exploitation, being exposed to sexualized content. So any sexualized material. It's something where, for example, child pornography or any form of pornography introduced to a child. There's studies showing the average age of exposure to that content for soft porn is 8, with studies showing as young as 6 years old. For hardcore pornography, including kink and violence, it's on average around 10, with studies showing as young as 8. And that's a nationwide statistic in the US.
So that's still elementary school.
Correct. And as we've connected with schools, like at CAST, our mission to empower our community to end sexual exploitation, we focus on human trafficking prevention, sex trafficking prevention, sexual exploitation prevention. And we do that through education, awareness, and collaboration. So we want to do events like this where we get to share what's going on in our community so that people know that there's a problem, so that they can then learn how do you end it before it begins. We do education opportunities. We go to middle schools and high schools and teach Power Over Predators, which is a nationwide curriculum, teaching students how do you identify and either avoid or safely get out of traps that predators use, understand internet safety, and then understand healthy versus toxic relationships. As we're going to schools, we're also connecting with staff and doing district-wide school trainings. As we do all of this, we're listening and learning from staff and from students. What are their experiences?
So what are some of their, what's kind of the strategies of those that are, perpetuating this issue, right? So if they're accessing these kind of young kids, right? What kind of ways are they enticing these kids that those kids fall into this exploitation?
Right. I think part of it is there's kind of 3 steps that oftentimes traffickers and exploiters will use. And so the first step is hiding in plain sight, right? And so when you're thinking the phrase stranger danger, it was something that growing up, I was always taught stranger danger, watch out, who's going to be lurking, creepy person lurking in the bushes, or, avoid the person offering, a van full of puppies or candy, or for me, free books, dangerous.
Yeah.
But, really 93% of the time in the United States and internationally, the predator is someone the victim knows. 93% of the time.
So like an uncle, a family
Could be a family member. The most common type of exploiter is a romantic partner. Second most common type is a family member. And now 30 to 40% of exploiters in the United States are teenagers.
So for instance, this could be like a fifth grader who's dating a seventh grader or something like that. And the grader is the one who's exploiting the fifth grader. I mean, I'm sure they
Correct.
could be in the same grade too, but
Right.
like this would be what's most common.
Yes. And so we had a school reach out to us for our Power of Predators program. And they were like, what is the youngest age you can come in?
Hmm.
For our licensure, it's sixth grade because we can teach middle school and high school. We're currently vetting elementary programs because so many teachers have been like, this issue is starting in third grade and it is rampant by fourth grade. And we had a story where a young girl was at a sleepover with her two best friends. She was a fourth grader, and they had been sharing messages of body empowerment. Your body's beautiful. It is gorgeous. You need to celebrate it. Feel empowered. All of these healthy messages. But then they were saying, let's take some photos and some videos of your naked body to celebrate your beauty. These are her two best friends. She's in fourth grade, and she's like, my body, okay, yeah, it can be beautiful. And so she took those photos, shared them with her two best friends, people she trusted. That week, they said, great, now do all of our homework for the rest of the year, or we're sending your image out to the whole school. And so for the remainder of fourth grade, all of fifth grade, and halfway through sixth grade, she had done 3 girls' homeworks while the other 2 didn't do any. And because of this threat of, if you don't do our homework, we're going to send your image out, which is a form of blackmail, which that's a form of sextortion and sexual exploitation. And in sixth grade, she was finally like, I can't do 3 people's homework anymore. And so she went to her 2 best friends, the people she thought she could trust, and was like, I can't do this anymore. And her image was sent out to the whole school.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
It was something that, and she was traumatized. She had to leave that school. But then there's the long-lasting effects. And I think too, when people are thinking of exploitation, that so often they think of the victim impact side. And it's like, oh, you've been in treatment, you've been in recovery, you're good to go. It is a long-lasting journey where it's like, even in that story, you have complex emotions of, you were told healthy messages of body empowerment and your body's beautiful. Yes. But then somebody took that message and used it against you. Those people who used it against you were people you thought you could trust, people you had connection and had relationship with. How do you build trust with friends moving forward? How do you build healthy relationships moving forward when the people you thought were healthy in your life exploited you? And then what is that long-lasting effect? I had clients who I had one client who was in the life. That's the phrase we use when you've been in trafficking or exploitation, in the life.
In the life, okay.
In the life, yep. And she had been in the life for 3 weeks, been out of it for 35 years. She had been in intensive therapy 5 days a week. She couldn't hold down a job. She couldn't move forward with her life. She couldn't build relationships with people. She barely left her house. That's a long-lasting effect that we can end before it ever begins. And so one of the traps predators use, right? You hide in plain sight and you build that trust and you're like, I'm normal, whatever normal means to you.
Yeah.
And so hide in plain sight, identify a victim's needs is the second piece, a trap that a predator uses. And oftentimes identify the need and then fulfill that need is the second step. So step 1, hide in plain sight. 2, identify and befriend or fulfill that need. And for people, we often think of need as a material vulnerability or an emotional vulnerability. Most people in anti-trafficking, or when they think of anti-trafficking, are thinking of the material vulnerability, which absolutely is, it's here, it's needed, support is needed to fulfill those material needs. Food, shelter, clothing, basic hygiene products, things that you need to survive. So when you're thinking of material vulnerability, you're thinking of, homeless youth, runaway youth, or this also applies for all ages, not just youth. But somebody who has, I need this to survive, an exploiter or a trafficker can be like, okay, yeah, I'll give you a place to crash. And Minnesota winters, if it's negative 14 out in the wintertime, you go outside and you're like, I need a place to stay. And they're like, perfect, you can crash on my couch if. And that leads into the third step, which is manipulation or conditions. And so it's hide in plain sight, meet and fulfill needs, and then manipulation. But for those needs, in the Twin Cities specifically, a homeless youth is approached for sex within the first 48 hours of being on the streets. In
Oh, wow.
my professional experience, that number is much closer to 12. So, from the clients I've worked with and from the survivor experts in my space that I've connected with, they haven't even spent a full night out on the streets and someone has approached them for sex to fulfill a material need.
Wow.
And I think it's something where exploiters are so good at sniffing out what do people need.
So are these individuals or are there some like organizations like gangs and stuff like that, right?
Mhm.
So I'm just thinking, are there just a ton of people wandering around the streets and they just see someone and they're like, kind of individually and on their own, like they're going off and targeting people? Or is there some kind of collective unit there that like people are, paid to go and sniff these things out?
Both and.
Okay.
So it's both. So there's individual circumstances and then there's organized crime. And so for organized crime, you can see that in gang initiation and it kind of ties in with the emotional vulnerability. So you see it most often, I think, manifested in gang situations, but it also applies to both. And it's something I'll spend some time talking about the emotional vulnerabilities too, because people in suburban or rural communities are like, well, I have a 2-parent household, stable income, middle class, upper middle class, upper class.
Mhm.
We don't have those material vulnerabilities. We have, and they don't look at the emotional vulnerabilities.
Like the example you gave, right? Where it's just a
Right.
girl that wants to feel, accepted. She's in what, fourth
Mhm.
grade, you said,
Yeah.
right? So I mean she's going to be naive to those kind of things and like a
Right.
very small mistake leads into multi-year consequences for her, right?
Right. And not knowing what to do in that situation. Like, how do you get out of sextortion?
Hmm.
But for kind of gang situations too, that can be a form of a initiation where you can have community, you can have that support, but then you can also have gang protection where it's like, hey, we're going to protect you. You're part of this family, you're part of this unit, but everybody's got to contribute. And so for some people, the expectation is you're going to contribute sexually.
Mm.
And that can vary, but it also is multifaceted and there's a lot of intersectionality. So with sex trafficking, you'll often see for individuals who have been impacted by sex trafficking for victims, there's often a criminal record associated because that's another leverage traffickers will use is they will often, not always, but often they will say, okay, I need you to either carry the drugs for me. I need you to steal this for me. Like, hey, we're in this together. We need to make ends meet. You need to do XYZ. So they commit, whether it's a minor offense or a major offense,
Hmm.
and you steal a car, you carry drugs, you have a prostitution charge, all of these criminal records. And then the trafficker uses that as a method of keeping them under their control. Well, you're going to get arrested.
Hmm.
You already have a criminal record. Who's going to hire you? What are your other options? You don't have other options.
Hmm.
And so, what does that look like? And so, with that, identifying and meeting somebody's needs and then converting that into manipulation
Hmm.
in the material side, it's like, yeah, couch surfing is probably the most common example that I've seen. But I've also seen like for a high school student who was on I think it was a soccer team where he wanted new sports gear and there were certain brands that everyone in his community was using. And one of the captains on the team was like, hey, I'll pay for that if you send me nudes after we win every game to
Hmm.
celebrate.
Hmm.
And it was like, well, I guess it doesn't cost me anything tangibly. I don't have the money to do it, but I could do that. Sure. But it's got to stay between us. Turns out that the captain of the team was selling it on OnlyFans
Oh
to get
gosh.
money without this person's knowledge or consent.
Hmm.
And so he was paying this individual in the form of like updated soccer gear, but it wasn't, the student didn't know what he was signing up for.
Hmm.
But then also, too, with the definition of sex trafficking, I think it's important to note. So there's the acts, the means, and purpose. The exception is if you are a minor or if you're a vulnerable adult and cannot give consent. So by legal definitions, cannot give consent.
Hmm.
So if there's an act and the purpose being sexual exploitation, if you're a minor, if you're 14 and you're like, well, I wanted to have sex with this person, legally you cannot give consent.
Hmm.
Therefore, it is still classified as potentially a form of either sex trafficking, but for sure sexual exploitation.
Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I'm thinking back to the example you gave of the girl and just like the emotional trauma of
Mhm.
that is, I don't want to say intriguing. That almost makes it sound like it's something, but
Mhm.
it's something worth exploring. I mean, I'm just thinking, like women or boys, right, that have sex for the first time, like that
Mhm.
opens up a gateway, right?
Mhm.
To where it's just if they have it for the first time, it's really tough to say no the second time, right?
Right.
Like, so you're dating someone, you're sexually active, and then you break up. Then you
Mhm.
date the second person. It's that much more difficult to be like, well, yeah, I did this before, but like now I'm going to stop again, right?
Mhm.
So it's just like that barrier has been broken. So in the in
Right.
the in the situation of the girl you gave an example of, or anyone else that falls into this, like her body is no longer like private, like it's
Mhm.
been publicly put out there, which makes it that much easier for her to say, well, it's already out there, so why not X, Y, and Z, right? Why not
Right.
go down these paths? So it's just someone has broken that barrier for that person. It makes it that
Mhm.
much more difficult for them to see themselves in kind of a pure way, even though like the mistake that girl made was so small. Like
Mhm.
that's a mistake that anybody could make.
Right.
So it's heartbreaking to see that play out.
Right. And it's not her fault, right?
Hmm.
Like she was told the message, and with the information she was given, she made a decision. You making that choice does not mean somebody gives you the right to hurt you.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter what you were wearing. It doesn't matter, like, if you initiated with them on social media, that doesn't give somebody permission to use your body sexually for their gain.
Hmm.
That's, it doesn't, I think oftentimes there's that sense of victim blaming of like, well, they did this and now actions have consequences. Actions do have consequences and there's pain and healing. There's a difference between actions having consequences and victim blaming. And
Hmm.
I think oftentimes when I do presentations for middle school, high school students, we'll sometimes talk through that where it's like, hey, you initiated with somebody on social media, started talking with them, felt a connection, and then they started asking for you without your clothes on,
Hmm.
for images of you without your clothes on, and you share it with them. And then they sell it online, upload it to porn sites or OnlyFans or other
Hmm.
sources like that. And they're like, well, I mean, you added them on social media and you sent that photo. Like it's kind of your fault, is the message that they're told, or that's the message that I hear from students. And it's like, no, it is, abuse is always the fault of the abuser.
Hmm.
You making a choice in that way of sharing a vulnerability and sharing a piece of yourself does not give someone else the right to cause you harm, to use your body against you, to use these messages against you. This is not your fault.
Hmm.
And I think oftentimes traffickers and exploiters will use that like, well, you already did it once. What's the big deal? Keep going.
Hmm.
Or, kind of exactly what you're saying. I've heard that from quite a few of the clients that I've worked with in the past in this space, where one girl too, where she was connected with her in a hotel room during one of the Freedom Flight sting operations I was with.
You connected with her or not?
I did.
Okay.
Yep. So I was kind of the victim liaison was
Hmm.
kind of the role in that position. So we partnered with them in the nonprofit space. So that was like one non-law enforcement person in the room.
So the law enforcement people, they were the ones that went out and kind of,
Mhm.
retrieved these individuals and brought them back. They went on kind of an
Correct.
operation, and then you were
Yep.
the one there to be comforting and to kind of talk then with the victims.
Yep. So law enforcement pretended to be a buyer. Once all the elements of the transaction was complete, where all the elements of a crime had been committed, whether it was trafficking or prostitution or whatever that looked like by legal standards, the goal was not to arrest the victim
Hmm.
and was not for prostitution charges or anything like
Right.
that. It was to connect with the victim, one, to potentially connect with the trafficker to hold them accountable for facilitating, but two, to also give that individual, the victim, a potential out if they wanted or needed it
Hmm.
in that moment. And that's where I came in, because there's some distrust between victim survivor experts in the community
Hmm.
at times, depending on the person, and law enforcement, just because of the intersectionality between criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation.
Hmm.
And there has been a history of law enforcement not always handling it with care.
Hmm.
And so I know law enforcement, the people I've been working with, have been really trying to reconcile that, but
Hmm.
there's still some healing in that journey space too. So, but with the victim in this situation, so I was the non-law enforcement associated person, the person who was there to be with that victim, to give them the support that they needed, to help them find resources, whether it was shelter, whether it was whatever their resources or needs were, to be in their corner
Hmm.
outside of any law enforcement capacity. Um, and for her, she was sharing her story of, she worked a full-time job and she did not have a trafficker facilitating this transaction. She was there. She was like, I'm here voluntarily. And I was like, okay, can you share a little bit more? And so she shared her journey. And I was like, can I just ask, if you could make this money in any other capacity, would you do it? And she was like, no, but I was raped as a child. And so my body's trash. So what's the point? I might as well make some money off of it.
Mm.
And so that was her kind of phrasing for it too. And it just stuck with me where she was like, my body's trash. Might as well make some money off of it. And it's like, it does have long-term impact where, it breaks that barrier where you give a piece of yourself or someone takes a piece of you. And it's like, well, it happened once, might as well profit from it now. And what does that look like? And so for the healing journey. And so she and I had an incredible conversation, and she's just such a strong person of being like, I want to live my best life, but wrestling and not getting a chance to heal from some of the trauma that happened in her childhood. She's like, I don't really know where to go from here. And I think that long-term impact, that's why we need long-term care providers and long-term support systems to help people through that journey, and to know that if it happens once, it's not the end.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, that sense of shame and guilt and blame when something happened to you that was not your fault or your choice in exploitation, in trafficking, in sexual abuse, there is a hope for a future.
Mm-hmm.
And your worth never changes no matter what happens to you.
Mm-hmm.
You were priceless the day you were born. You're going to be priceless on the day you take your last breath and every second in between. And when we connect with students, we often, sometimes if I can get to the bank in time, I'll ask for like a really crisp $100.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring it to a presentation and I'm like, here is fresh off the press, super crisp, real money, $100. Who wants it? Especially the middle schoolers, they go crazy. Like, I want it.
I bet they do. Yeah.
Right. Some of the high schoolers are like, I do. That'd be nice. And I'm like, no, you can't run up and grab it. But I crumple it up and I'm like, how much is this worth? And they're like, $100. And I'm like, yeah. Does anybody still want it? And they're like, yeah. And I throw it on the ground and I stomp on it. I'm like, how much is it worth? Still worth $100. If I throw it in the trash next to a dirty diaper and a half-eaten cheeseburger, how much is it worth?
Mm-hmm.
It's still worth $100. No matter what happens to that, that's just a piece of paper. Like, you are a human being. Your worth never changes no matter what happens to you.
Mm.
And that's what we want people to take away and know.
That's a beautiful message.
Yeah.
And we're gonna dive in a little bit to like towards the second half of this. We're also gonna talk about roads towards healing, right? So we're going to really dive into some of those. There's some really cool things, of course, that you guys are doing. We're going to highlight another organization, Corey's House, and we've got Renee coming on as well. So we'll kind of round table that a little bit. So just so the listener knows, there's some great things going on to push back against this darkness, but we do have to spend a little bit more time in the darkness here just to kind of unpack it, because that's the first part of this, is to people need to understand this is going on, because if we don't know what's going on, or to your point, going on in your backyard, if you live in suburbia, like a very nice area, these things are happening in your area too. One question I do have, as you were talking about that, I've actually never thought about this, but to the degree that you kind of put it, so you can just guess. So I'm thinking of like pornography, or certainly, prostitution. Like, what percentage of people do you think that are, let's just go with girls, or both, I guess you could say, that are in this industry? How many of them do you think were sexually harmed as a child, right? So how many of these people that might even be quote unquote voluntarily doing it in their 20s, something like that? How many of that? How much of that is really just an offshoot of some kind of exploitation or trafficking or some real sexual harm that was done to them as a child? And this is just a ripple effect that you're seeing.
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer.
What would be your guess? Renee's over there. She says 100%. She says 100%. Yeah, that was my guess. I was thinking it's got to be very close to 100%.
Right. It's something where every person's story is unique and every person's story is different. And so, but oftentimes people who actions, like, you don't change something about yourself, or you don't give a piece of yourself without a reason, right? And so what is the catalyst? And so for some people, it's that emotional connection with a romantic partner and they ask for more of you. It can be a family member who's like, hey, we got to pay rent. We got to meet needs. What does that look like? Like, I need you to hang out with our friends for this party. And you're like, well, you told me the last one I went to was going to be the last one. We need a roof over our head. What does that look like? And so I think, I don't know the correct answer. So I'm one where if I don't know it or I don't have a good guesstimation, but I do want to say,
go ahead.
I'm going to say,
I'm comfortable just, kind of guessing, but go ahead.
Yes. And so one thing I will say though, too, is we really try to be intentional with inclusive language because statistics show that between 30 and 50% of victims do identify as boys. And so oftentimes that's a misnomer of like, this is a girl issue. And as we've been more inclusive with language, I've connected with victim survivor experts who are male, and they were like, I didn't come forward for 20 years because I was told this was a girl issue, or I always thought this was a girl issue. And so a lot of times as parents, you think, I got to protect my daughter from this. You got to protect both kids. You got to protect all kids from this. And the LGBTQIA+ community is disproportionately targeted too for both the emotional vulnerability as well as potentially material vulnerability, especially if they're kicked out of their home. And so those are some statistics in this that I can also share. But
30 to 50% are boys.
Yeah.
So this is on both sides of this. Yeah.
Right. The buyers. So there's kind of three parties or three stakeholders that are often included in this conversation. There's the victim, the buyer, the trafficker when it comes to human trafficking. And the buyer, most often, vast majority, do identify as men. Victims, it can be anywhere from 30 to 50% identifying as boys, the other half identifying as girls. It includes all genders, right? And the traffickers, I don't know the specific numbers. I know it's mixed. So it's, to say that it's only the men's facilitating and only the victims are female, it's not a good representation. And so we really want to be inclusive that, traffickers can be girls, victims can be boys. Buyers can be both men and women. And normally the buyers tend to be adults, but it can be minors too. And so especially with 30 to 40% of exploiters being teenagers, peer-to-peer exploitation is on the rise as well. And it's been a major shift in culture with that as well.
Yeah, I do want to dive back into that in a second. But yeah, I remember back, I think it was when I was in New Hampshire, someone was presenting on this to some degree, and they were saying one of the more popular routes are to have girls be the first contact for the sex trafficking, right? So especially especially in kind of that more, and I know this is not the majority, right? But if it's someone who's being kind of more contacted by someone they don't know, which I think you said is only like 20% or 15%.
It's like 7%.
7%.
Yeah, for stranger danger.
Yeah, but the stranger danger ones, it's, some kind of girl say, will approach, someone younger and say, hey, I need help with this, right? So it's a little bit, the guard's down a little bit more, and then they'll lead them to maybe some men that might take. And I know that's the minority, but of the way that plays out. But understanding that, I think that there's guys and girls involved on all three of these stages. Maybe the buyers primarily guys, but that's quite helpful. So if you can hash out a little bit of, because I think you talked about like the romantic partners, right? So I'm thinking about the way this would play out for middle schoolers or something like that, and how that exploitation takes place, even without kind of some kind of devious adult kind of plotting these things, but this can just take place kind of organically within a middle school classroom. Could you kind of hash out how that plays out?
Right. So I think, there's one example. This was a few years ago, but it happened in northern Minnesota where it was a young underclassman who she had special needs. She was really struggling to fit in. She was trying to find community and couldn't find a lot of friendship. And then the captain of the cheerleading squad comes in and befriends her, includes her at lunch, hangs out with her after school, really building this community with her. And then at school during lunch, she was like, hey, why don't you head to the bathroom? Some of our friends are going to come and visit you. Do what they say. They're going to give you some cash. You get $5, I'll get $5. And pretty much this captain of the cheerleading group, she was facilitating sexual transactions in the school bathroom during lunch, where she would get classmates to pay $10 for sexual favors. And this girl was like, well, I don't really want to do it, but I also don't want to lose my friendships. So what are my options? And so to keep her friendship with someone, she continued and she provided these services. And so it's that fear of loss of, again, meeting an emotional vulnerability and then manipulating it for gain and causing this girl harm for her gain. And she was, the cheerleader was prosecuted for sex trafficking. So that's one example. Also too, with like online, I think too, for the relationship piece and how like, especially online, people are like stranger danger, what apps do I use or which ones are safe and which ones are not. Perception of what a victim knows. Like when we say someone the victim knows, what that means can mean different things for people. And so if you're video gaming with somebody, you've never met them in person, but you've been video gaming with them for 2 weeks, for the victim, that could be a definition of, oh yeah, I know them. I play with them all the time. Or when we're talking about healthy versus toxic relationships, and relationships can be romantic, but it can also be platonic. It's, I ask students, like, how many hours does it take for you to build a solid friendship with somebody? Like, be a good friend where you both know each other, you're willing to share a few details about each other. And some of them say 60 to 100. Most of them say 3 to 5.
3 to 5 days?
3 to 5 hours.
3 to 5 hours?
Yes. And so it's something where, oh yeah, I know them. You've spent 3 hours with them. And how that shapes the relationship and how that shapes trust. Technology has rapidly expanded your reach for connection, but it has also shortened the length of time for people to feel connected with one another. And it's really a shallow connection with that sense of it's fulfilling an emotional need. And I think the pandemic really exacerbated that issue of that was how a lot of our kids are taught. Well, you have to take your classes through online, or, you can hang out on Zoom with your friends, or you can video game with your friends or engage with them on social media. And so you think you're building this trusted relationship with somebody. You've known them for 3 hours. Or there was one law enforcement officer too, who did undercover online operations. And from the time of connecting with someone to when they would receive a nude image from them, like what they kind of gauged how long it would take for somebody to be like, hey, I don't know you. How do I give you the perception that I know you so that you can trust me so that I can receive that content from you online? From this one person, this one professional's experience, the average was 18 minutes.
18 minutes.
18 minutes.
Which I'm sure this is not the first time that these victims have done this, probably, right? So it just becomes a habit.
Right. And so when we think of like when someone, the victim, knows what that definition means, like you met somebody online, you talk for 15 minutes straight, they start saying all the things you emotionally want to hear that you're indicating. And when we
that's
share
their expertise, right? Like these individuals that are doing this, these perpetrators, like that's their dark craft, right? Is how to earn trust from you very quickly so that they can get what they want from you.
Exactly. And so while you're cooking dinner and they're in their room doing their homework, from point of contact to potentially getting that image could be under 20 minutes. Is that common? It varies case to case, but from that one professional's experience, that was consistently her average was 18 minutes from the research she did.
And then the follow-up from that is once they have the image, now they can get you to do other things. Is that correct? So how does that play out? So if someone's got just an image, right? So this is what do they do from there? Right.
So things like sextortion. So sextortion is a huge piece of sexual exploitation that's on the rise. And it also ties in with sex trafficking. So for example, kind of what we see with a lot of middle schoolers too, like you're playing video games, you're connecting with somebody, you start DMing or direct messaging, private messaging them. And they're like, hey, you're such a great player. Hey, this is amazing. Oh, you're so smart. They're sharing these different things. And they're like, hey, I'd love to connect more. So then they go into a private chat room, start engaging and having a conversation where, again, the predator is saying all the quote unquote right things and says, I'd love to get to know you better. Can you send me a photo? Wow, you are so attractive, or you're so beautiful, or you're so hot. I want to see more. Can you show me X, Y, Z? And so they start asking, like, with your shirt off, totally naked, whatever that looks like. And then this person feeling this connection with a person that they haven't met live, they've only been playing online with, they're like, sure. They start sharing these pieces of themselves. Then the predator's like, great, now I need you to pay me $1,000 or this is going to be uploaded onto all the social media sites, or this is going to be uploaded to, I have your handle from social media. This is going to be uploaded and you're going to be tagged and everybody's going to see it. And I think there's also an element, especially in the faith-based community, where that sense of like, is my purity impacted by this, and that fear and that shame, and you don't know what to do.
And probably my parents are going to be upset with me.
Right. I'm going to get into trouble. I'm so embarrassed by this. I don't want my whole church community to see me like this. And so, but they don't have $1,000. They're 12 years old. Where are they going to get $1,000? And so they start panicking and trying to figure out what are their options. And youth who sext, which is sending sexualized content digitally, are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide. And a big piece of the reason why they're attempting or completing suicide is because of sextortion, because they don't see any other way out. And so that's one example of how we're seeing this among like middle school, among high school. It could also be on the school bus. We're seeing things where it's like, your phone is Fort Knox. Your parent put all the apps on, they're wrapping it in bubble wrap, basically, like almost a dumb phone, right? Like you can make phone calls, you can check your email, that's it. That's great. But what happens when your classmate shows you something on the bus and they show a pornographic video? We had a situation with one of our partner organizations where I think he was 9 years old. He was shown something by an upperclassman on the upperclassman's phone of a video. And he was like, this is what girls like. This little boy is like, wow, okay, I'm responding to this, and goes home, plays with his 8-year-old neighbor within less than an hour of being on the bus, starts acting out what he saw on that video because he was told that's what girls like. The mother of the 8-year-old comes out and wants him on the National Sex Offender Registry at 9 years old. It had been less than an hour from when he was shown something by an upperclassman on a school bus to when he was acting it out and playing with it with his neighbor, to when the mother intervenes and wants him held legally accountable for harming this 8-year-old, which he thought was just playing because that's what he was told. And we're hearing a lot of stories from bus drivers too, where there's been full content or people are having sex on the back of the bus and other kids are videoing it and uploading it. I had a bus driver share that with me this last year. And so it's something where—
And these are young kids.
Yeah. And what do you do with all of these things, right? And so it can feel messy, it can feel complicated, and it looks so different depending on people's stories. And I think that's one big takeaway is we're talking in generalized terms. Every story is unique. Every person is unique. How this looks can be nuanced. There's no one size fits all. But if it's causing harm sexually for gain, that's exploitation. And so it could be online, it can be in person. The most common places are sleepovers, school buses, lunchtime, whether it's recess or at lunch, are often the most common places that youth are being exposed to this content and engaging with this content. And also if they have technology in their room when they're supposed to be going to bed. If you're wanting one easy way to like, how do I protect my child from this? Don't let them have their phone or their laptop or any technological outlet in their room at night. Get them an analog alarm clock, whatever, go old school. Like, you know, they don't need their phone for their alarm clock. There are other options. I'm sorry to all students out there who are like, don't tell them. But it's something where it's true. And I use my phone for my alarm clock too. So, but it's something where for parents—
But you're also not 12.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. And so, and I teach internet safety to people. So, but it's, you know, there is no such thing as a safe app or not safe app. Again, I teach internet safety. I'm still salty about this. I got solicitations on Scrabble. Words with Friends. Scrabble is the least provocative game on your phone. And I got solicitation. I'm like, I don't even play with strangers. Like, it's just, I got random messages.
There's an army of hell out there. This is horrifying. This is just absolutely horrifying.
It's everywhere. And so what can we do about it?
Yeah.
Because we can get into all of these stories and sensationalize. And I think we have this as a community, like a true crime phenomena where it's like, we want to know all the nitty gritty details. And I think, especially at CAST, we're trying to also desensationalize, where it's like, we want you to know these stories because we want you to know this really does exist and it's very common. but also not get into trauma porn
Mhm.
where it's like, do you need to know all the nitty gritty details? No. Do you need to know a sexual act was conducted against this child and here's the consequences that are unfolding and we need to help them? Yeah. So
Mhm.
how do we go from here?
Real quick, I just want to one thing that just been kind of on my mind. So I'm guessing, and this goes back to kind of the earlier question of, these individuals that are in pornography, they've probably been harmed to some degree when they're younger. And Renee says 100%, but I'm thinking of, so like the captain of the cheerleading squad, that
Mhm.
example, right? So how does she get to that point, right? I'm guessing, and I could be wrong here, and would be a guess, but it seems like something has happened to her in her past, right? I
Mhm.
just can't imagine a child who's not exposed to at least pornography or some of these other harmful things you're talking about getting to a point where she's like, I'm going to take advantage of another person to this degree and and sexually exploit them, right? So it seems like there's all of these ripple effects. So the person
Mhm.
who's doing that, who's the captain of the cheerleading team that's harming this other person, I'm guessing she's been harmed, and I don't know this individual, but it just seems like it's this ongoing ripple effect, right? This 9-year-old who's been harmed by this upperclassman now goes out and
Mhm.
harms the 8th grader or the 8-year-old, right? And then the
Right.
8-year-old's, what's going to happen to that individual? It just seems like
Mhm.
it's just this ongoing ripple effect. So
Mhm.
hence the importance of we need to nip this in the bud, right? Like you need to
Right.
be able to provide healing, but like goodness gracious, where do we go from here?
Right. And I think one thing too on this is like, so I also did counseling for sex offenders coming off probation and parole. So
Hmm.
they had to hang out with me at 5 a.m. I don't drink a lot of coffee and I'm a very bubbly person. So if that talking about deviant thought cycles and your emotional well-being at 5 with me,
Yeah.
if that's not reason to avoid offending, I don't know what is. But like it's something where in that group, my cohort, 80% of them, so yeah, about 80% had some form of trauma in their past, where
Hmm.
one of them, for example, he was abused by a family member. And every time the abuse happened, he was told, this is what love is before the abuse took place. And so when he entered a romantic relationship with his girlfriend and they started engaging, she was like, I want love. I want a whirlwind romance. I want to feel loved. He was like, well, this is what love is. So he did what was done to him.
Hmm.
He told me, he was like, I didn't even know I committed an offense until I was arrested.
Hmm.
Like, I didn't know something was wrong until she called the police. I was told this is what love is. She wanted love. I thought that's what it was. And
Hmm.
so we had to talk through that. But there was still 20% where that wasn't part of their story.
Hmm.
But I think it comes down to power and control. And people want to feel empowered and they want to feel in control of circumstances. And so if you're in an environment where circumstances happen to you that take away a sense of power or control in your own life, you try to potentially seek it elsewhere.
Hmm.
And so that could also be a factor, right? So it's not necessarily like trauma happened to you, you have to do trauma to someone else, or
Right.
that can unfold. And that is, many perpetrators have been a victim at some point themselves,
Hmm.
but it's not everybody. But a common theme from my professional experience has been they felt like they lacked something somewhere and they found that they could get a semblance of satisfaction here.
Hmm.
Or another big piece of it is the relationship between pornography and
I was
sexual
gonna ask about that. Yeah.
exploitation. And so we talk about that on the internet and the brain, and I can get super nerdy into neuroplasticity and like neuroconnections and stuff. So rein me in if I'm too much.
Go
But
for it.
but when we look at pornography use, the evidence shows that pornography and sexual exploitation are strongly connected
Hmm.
and that there is a direct relationship between sexual exploitation and pornography use. And in our current culture and climate, a lot of times pornography is currently being labeled as sexual health and wellness.
I know.
And the evidence does not support that. And so, especially for minors, when you look at a sexualized image, there's two parts of your brain that we really focus in on. Your amygdala, which is your emotional response. It also, that part of your brain deals with sexual drive and impulse control, emotional response. Your amygdala is fully developed the day you're born. So your emotional gas pedal, if you will, can go full throttle from day one.
I know. We've got a 3-month-old at home that was colic. I can attest to that.
Yeah. And so, your impulse control, your emotional response, and sexual drive fully developed the day you're born. Your other part of your brain we look at is the prefrontal cortex.
Mm.
That does rational, logical thinking. It overrides impulse control. That is not fully developed until a later date. That date has changed due to technology. So I can touch base on that too. And I think this is going to be really important, especially for parents and grandparents. Your prefrontal cortex, your mental brake pedal, is not fully developed right now. The current age is between 26 and 30. For our grandparents' generation, that was closer to 17 to 19.
Wow.
For like my parents' generation, that was between 22 and 24. My generation, 26 to 30. Elementary children, that's expected to be 30 to 35, and newborn babies potentially between 35 and 40. That is the impact technology has had on changing our impulse control. We're creating neural pathways, so ways of how we process information, develop habits, and respond to things. Technology is playing a profound role in how we react to content and how do we problem solve. So when we think of this, especially for like grandparents and parents, they're like, well, we had magazines, like we had Playboy, we had this, we had that. I didn't get into an addiction because of it. Fair. Your brain is also potentially more developed at that stage when you were 17 than when your 17-year-old child is looking at this content now. Or for younger ages, when you look at a sexualized image, your brain produces dopamine. That's for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
For children, your brain, when you look at a sexualized image, can produce up to 4 times the amount of dopamine. So if you and your child look at the same image, your child could have almost 4 times the response to that image than you do. And if that image is actually a video, their brain is sending them the message that this is actually happening to them, which is different than necessarily a still shot or a photograph or a magazine. It can be that this is happening to me, I'm having this emotional response, and you're getting a high off of it.
So you're saying for them, it's almost as if they have engaged in the sexual action themselves.
Correct. And I mean, there are some studies too that say your brain with that amount of dopamine can light up in a similar way to your first shot of heroin. I need to verify that. That's what I've been told. Take that one with a grain of salt.
Okay.
But if you're thinking, if your kid took a shot of heroin on a school bus, how are you going to react? If your child looks at your classmate's phone at a video, are you reacting with the same level of concern or responsiveness? If their brain is reacting in the same way for the addictive capacity, what's the response going to be? And so when you're looking at a sexualized image, your brain lights up, you get an emotional high. Same as an addiction, you start pursuing things that will help you get that high. So you look at one image, then you look at another, then another, and another. Eventually, you become desensitized to it because you're training your brain to respond to those images. So in order to get that same level of high, you either need to consume more content or different type of content. And that tends to get more deviant or kinkier or more violent or aggressive to produce that same level of high. And so you're looking at all this content, it's escalating. Eventually, even the kinkiest or the most violent pornographic image or video is not producing that high. People will be like, well, now I need to engage in person. So they engage with somebody, but many people are not comfortable doing certain activities that would be depicted in these films or videos. And so they're like, well, if I can't get it willingly from a romantic partner, do I need to purchase it? And so then you start investing in purchasing it. And how do you know that person is there voluntarily? And I think a lot of times people are like, especially for Johns or for buyers, they can also be called Johns. When I've worked with individuals who have purchased, they're like, well, they seemed really into it. And it's like, they're told either you need to act as if you're into it so that you get maximum payment or XYZ. Like there's going to be severe consequences. We could beat you. We could cause severe damage to you. We could harm your loved one, especially if they're a parent of another child and that child is in that home. And it's like, okay, well, then you don't get to see your kid for 2 weeks if you don't meet your quota. And if you're going to tip better when they're acting enthusiastic, but if they don't act enthusiastic or if they don't meet their quota, they're not going to get their needs met or see their children or what that consequence could be. Are they really doing this willingly? And so that's where it starts with this one image, and it can escalate into so much more. And I've seen that quite a few of the clients I've worked with for the sex offender side. So I use clients for both I've worked on the victim side and in the counseling session, and it escalates, right? So I'm not getting the high. So what can I do to help meet that need? And there's a study in Canada where they interviewed over 800 buyers as well. So if you ever want to look one up to see different demographic layouts and different circumstances, many of these people are in loving, committed relationships, are family people with children, and they're purchasing a sexual act from someone that's their kid's age. And so it's like, it all starts, not all of it, but many of it starts with that connection between pornography, a porn addiction that escalates. And for youth, like, we're not about shaming or blaming at CAST. We are about giving people the knowledge and tools they need so that they can make an informed decision. And so when we're talking about this with middle school and high school students, many of them, when I ask the question, I'm like, how many of you know someone who's either sent or received a nude text message? Normally, it's between 75 and 100%. The one exception was in a homeschool co-op group. The majority were homeschool co-op.
Mm-hmm.
Of that group, it was about 50%.
Still 50%.
Yes.
Wow.
In rural, they go to their homeschooling community group, church, and that's it. And that's where their communities are. And of them, that was over 50%. It was closer, I think, about 60%. So it's something where parents are like, well, my kids aren't exposed to that, or my kid's a good kid, they're not going to do that. This has nothing to do with good kid, bad kid. This has entirely to do with the culture we live in, with these messages of normalizing. If they're told pornography is a form of sexual health and wellness, and the people around them are like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. It's fine. If those are the messages they're receiving and you as the parent are not talking about that or providing any other context, then they're going to go with who is informing them on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And so for students, we're like, it's like a pharmaceutical commercial. Take this one drug and here's 37 side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, not about shaming or blaming, but we talk about pornography and we're like, okay, we just want you to know the 37 side effects so you can make an informed decision. And you train, when you look at pornography, you train your brain to respond to pixels instead of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have your kiss with your romantic partner and you're like, well, we don't feel a spark, it might have zero to do with your compatibility with your romantic partner and 100% a side effect of pornography use. And so we talk through some of those risks and vulnerabilities, but that's where pornography can often lead into sexual exploitation. And that was the long, dramatic version of where it starts with one image and it escalates and escalates and escalates. But also the porn industry, if they're a business, well, if we can get somebody to be a lifelong purchaser, get them when they're young, when they become addicted or when they're most likely to become addicted, and then we've got a buyer for life.
Mm-hmm.
And then they need to buy more and more and more. And then we just put different payment levels for the kinkier or violent content. And then they'll buy into that too. And then we've got our long-term cash flow. And so it's part of a systematic enterprise for making money. So it's one of those complex, there's so many different facets to it, but that's something where.
Yeah, where you can see why they're projecting. And I'm sure there's a lot more that goes into this, but when you say they're projecting that this is growing to such a degree that in five to 10 years, it's going to overtake the drug industry. Because you also said, hardcore porn video, average age 11, even as young as 9?
10. Yep.
10.
And then there have been some studies that have shared that it's been closer to 8.
Wow. So if you've got a kid accessing that by 8 or 10, like what's going to happen by the time they're 16 or 17? Mm-hmm. If they're that many years into this, by that point, they're going to be darker down that road of what you're talking about, where it gets more kinky, more violent, more dark. So you've got 16-year-olds running around who've got, 8 years of porn addiction underneath their
Mhm.
belt, and they're into these very dark things. What's their projection when they're 24? And you're saying their frontal cortex isn't going to be even formed
Mhm.
by the time they're in their early 30s. Like what kind of people are we producing once they're in their 20s? And we're producing people that are going to be buyers.
Mhm.
Not 100%, but it's going to be a growing number. So it does seem like pornography is one of these chief issues that we should certainly be talking about as a church. And I know you're talking about it at
Mhm.
CAST and those other organizations, but
Yeah.
that's horrific.
Yeah. The FBI says that pornography is the jet fuel to sexual sex trafficking
Hmm.
specifically. Um, but yeah, if there's not a demand, like it's not only about the supply. If we can target the demand too, and if people aren't buying, people are going where money is made.
Hmm.
And so when people have an opportunity to make easy money, and for traffickers, when a drug is used, it's a one and done.
Hmm.
You have to produce more of that drug. A human being, in a very horrific way of saying this, is a renewable resource. It's not just one and done. You could potentially, like I had a client once where she had to service 40 people a day
40 people a day.
at minimum was her
Oh my
quota.
gosh.
And it was like, and she was paid for her, like her cost of living. She was brought from a different community where she had never seen an airplane before. And she was
Mm.
told her flight cost $80,000. She had never seen an airplane or heard of it. So she was like, well, I didn't know. I'm from a very rural, poor community. They're taking me across the planet. Okay, that's how much it costs. And they're like, well, you get $1 a day towards your debt. So you'd have to service at least 80,000 people to basically cover your flight to that location. And so it's this form of like, you're never going to pay off your debt.
Hmm.
And so if she left, then they were like, well, then we'll bring your sibling over and then she can pay off your debt and her debt.
So how do you deal with a client like that? So you said this is one of your clients, right? So how do you just go about what's that look like? What's first contact? What's this look like as you continue to work with this person?
Yeah. So that was back when I was a caseworker.
Okay.
And so in the casework side, if somebody, normally it takes 6 to 7 tries to get out of the life. And so I think that's also important for people to understand is that like, it isn't just, oh, we're rescuing people. Now they're saved. At CAST, we're like, we don't save, we support. Right. And it's like, we don't want to strip a victim survivor of agency. They have a voice. They have autonomy and they have power. And somebody has tried to take power away from them. How do we support them as they take their own power back? And so when there's also a difference between wanting to get out of the life and being ready to get out of the life. And so there are times where, especially if they're an adult, there's some differences with minors as well, just because, again, legal age of consent. Can you consent to be, you can't legally consent
Hmm.
to some of this, but for adults as well, that was my area of expertise. When they're ready, they're seeking support, connecting with different nonprofits, law enforcement, or agencies, reaching out. A lot of outreach programs when you can spread the word like, hey, if you're ever pulled in, here's where you can go. Here's what you can do. One of my colleagues, she connected with somebody in England, in one of the common tracks where people were in person, getting into cars, providing services, getting out, being trafficked in their space. And she was like, hey, if you ever want to get out of the life, here's a card. She got chewed out a bit, like, you don't know me, you don't know my story, leave me alone. She's like, totally fine. Take the card if you want it. And she did, put it in the bottom of her purse. 7 years later, she still had that card tucked at the bottom of her purse. And she walked into the office and was like, can I get out? Can I have some help? And they come alongside. And
Hmm.
so seeking help and support, though, it's complex because depending on where you're located, I mean, internationally, there are few resources. And I think that's part of why we do awareness is because the amount of resources available for the amount of people being impacted, if every person who is impacted by sexual exploitation seeks help, we are vastly understaffed, underfunded, undersupported to meet those demands. A big piece of it is people don't know where to go. They don't know how to ask for help. That's why we go into middle school and high schools. That's why we teach students in an age-appropriate way what this issue is and how do they get help. We also are launching our district-wide staff training this summer, where we're training entire staff of school districts, bus drivers, recess monitors, lunch staff, nurses, teachers, admin, everyone. How do you support and come alongside people who've been impacted? What are your options? You got to spread awareness and you've got to spread education. So it's hard for people to get out of the life if they don't know where to go, they don't know what to do. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is a great resource because you can text 24/7, you can call 24/7, you can check their website. They have it in English and in Spanish. They've got some resources there too to walk you step by step. How do you get out? But it's tough. And one of the things as community members, if you're like, I'm an everyday community member who I don't think I know anybody impacted by this. I identify as oh gosh, I
You're
talk
good.
with my hands a lot. It's a miracle they're staying in this place. But I don't know anybody to my knowledge. I'm considered like the quote unquote average Joe. What am I supposed to do? If somebody discloses to you that exploitation is part of their journey, whether it's sexual violence, sexual abuse, sextortion, all of these things, I love a good cheesy acronym, OARS. Observe, affirm, report, support. Paddle to safety. Like grab your oars, listen without judgment. Affirm. A lot of times traffickers are said, if they ask you a question, it's because nobody believes you, right? And growing up, when we want to solve a problem, what do? We gather all the information we can. How do we gather that information? We ask questions. Traffickers and exploiters often count on that. And they're like, well, if they ask you questions, because they don't believe you. So when somebody's like, hey, I think something bad happened to me, or something's making me really uncomfortable, or I think I might be trafficked, or I think I might be, something's wrong. Very rarely does somebody use the language, I've been trafficked, or identify as a victim. I've had many people where it's like, have you been trafficked? No. Oh, have you been in the life? Oh yeah, I've been in the life for 4 years. So it's that language and terminology. But like, hey, I think something's off. And if you're like, what happened? When did that happen? What's going on? Because you want to learn and understand. First thing they hear is they're asking me a question. They don't believe me. So when you listen, affirm. I believe you. Thank you for trusting me with your story. You did the right thing by coming forward. I'm with you in this. You don't have to face this alone. Affirm, report. It is not your job to be the judge or jury in this. You get to have the joy of being the person that's in their corner, loving them and supporting them. And so walk them through that process, saying, I'm here. I'm in your corner. I'm here to listen to you. I will believe you. If you tell me that a raccoon and an octopus attacked you on the sidewalk, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm here for you. Is it your job to go see if there's actually an octopus or raccoon in the corner? Like, no, you get to just love that person well. And then when you make a report, let law enforcement check if there's the raccoon or the octopus. Let them do the investigation. Let the victim service coordinator at law enforcement agencies have them be that support system too, along with you, where you just get to love the person well and support them. And I think part of it too is not just handing somebody a resource and say, give them a call and help, but actually grab your phone or their phone, put the call on speakerphone, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, call the BCA, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, call the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. Any one of those resources have ability to guide you where you need to go. Because when I've done casework in the past, connecting with people who are seeking help, I had one client where she came in and she was like, yeah, it's been a couple years. The last time I came in, somebody gave me a brochure and they said, hey, call this number. And I was like, okay, can you share a little bit about what was the hesitation or problem with that? Like what's going on with that? Can you just share more about it? And she was like, well, yeah, I was told for years, this is her words. She is very intelligent. But she was like, I was told I was too stupid to know when I needed to eat. I was too stupid to know when I needed to use the bathroom. The only thing I was smart enough was to provide sexual favors. That was the only thing I was intelligent enough to do.
Were their parents involved in this situation? Like, were parents part of the problem? Or
So
was this
she had had an unhealthy home environment. And so she had left at a young age. So again, she was a case of a runaway youth who had been couch surfing with friends and then found her own apartment eventually, and then got into a toxic relationship with someone who then said, hey, we have to make ends meet. I need you to do these services for us to make ends meet. And then started taking power and control in that situation. But for her, she was like, and so when the person gave me that brochure and said, hey, make this phone call, all I felt was, I'm too stupid to make this phone call. What am I supposed to do? I don't know what to say. I don't know, like, what do I do? What if they ask me a question? I don't know how to answer that. And it could be so overwhelming.
So the one thing that one person could have done is to make the phone call for her.
Yeah.
And then to come alongside of her in kind of moving her forward, you're saying.
Right. Do it with the person, not just to the person, and not just sending them on their way, but saying, hey, do you want to call together? Like I was doing outreach out on Lake Street in Minneapolis, with one of my previous jobs. And, there was a young lady who had to flee her environment very quickly. It was middle of winter. It was, I think, maybe like -5 out. So it was just below well, I guess just below freezing is 0 for me.
Yeah.
Now it's
this
colder.
is Minnesota terminology here. Yeah. It was a warm winter day.
It was a warm, brisk. Yeah. It was almost 2 a.m. and we had called all the resources that were 24/7. The nearest shelter for her to get into was Duluth, which was 3 hours away. She had to be out of that venue by 8 a.m. So it's 2 a.m, drive 3 hours. She gets 3 hours of sleep, 2.5 maybe, and has to be out. And then she's in a city she doesn't know. That's the nearest place she could have a bed to rest.
Wow.
And so she was like, well, what are my options? And looking at what those were, it was limited. But we sat there together and we called through all the numbers we were in the car, had heated, like the heater on. We went and grabbed her some extra clothing because she didn't even have time to leave with her winter jacket. Like she really had to leave that situation quickly. But making those calls, I felt helpless because there wasn't a good solution. And I look at her and I'm like, I don't know what to do. I'm feeling really frustrated because I want you to have a safe place to rest. But none of these places are open. And she was like, you know what? The fact that you're sitting here calling with me, that is enough. And so we made sure she had some food, made sure we got her to a place where she felt comfortable. She got to kind of pick and choose. She was an adult as well. But it was just that sense of like, I think we can often have the sense of responsibility. I have to fix this. I have to be the one to take and be the solution. And it's like, come alongside with that person. And how do you be a good support person with them? Not just doing things for or to them, but with them.
Well, thank you for doing what you're doing. That's amazing to do that. Yeah.
No, well, I'm excited to be a part of the anti-trafficking movement. And as somebody who personally didn't know anybody, has not had lived experience in this space, where was my place? I'm excited to create a nonprofit or be a part of a nonprofit that invites community members that are like, where do I start?
Yeah.
I don't even know what questions to ask. This is where we want you to start, by listening and learning.
So I want to hear, so maybe 3 categories I'm thinking. So what should parents do? Right. As they're kind of, I've got a 4-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son, and this is scary. Right. Yeah. So what should parents do? And then maybe I'm thinking like, at least what should the church do? What kind of things can a church do to help with this, right? I'm just thinking of our own church here in Waconia. Like it certainly happens here. We've got a school. God forbid it happens in the school, but it could be happening in the school. So let's start with parents and then maybe church and school. What can we do?
Right. Good question. Like you hear all this information and you feel like this is heavy. And I want to encourage people, like, when you understand what the problem is, that's how you get to be part of the solution. So I'm excited to get into the solution side. So for parents, the number one thing you can do is have healthy conversations with your child about this. And it's awkward and it is uncomfortable. And I want to encourage you, get comfortable with the uncomfortable, because that is where positive change happens. And so talking with your children about this and invite them into the conversation. Ask for their thoughts, ask for their feedback, build that trust, and give them knowledge and tools. I've talked with a lot of parents where they want to wrap their kids in bubble wrap and they want to be the snowplow and the helicopter and protect them from everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be helpful until it's not, because you need to equip your children to be able to handle this. There's avoidance and then addressing. And children need to be equipped to do both. How do you avoid a toxic situation or a potentially exploitive situation to begin with? But then if you can't, or something happens where you're pulled into it, how do you address it safely? And so I know a lot of parents want to focus on, well, we got to avoid these. We're going to put all the parental apps. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. All of these wonderful tools. That's great. You can make your kid's phone Fort Knox, but what happens on the bus when your classmate flips the phone around?
Or at the baseball game, right?
Right. Or the sleepover, or I had 3 families, different places of Twin Cities in Western Wisconsin. All 3 of them had sons that dealt with porn addictions, all from a bus ride in different contexts, different communities, from to and from school, to and from a youth camp, and to and from hockey practice. And so, right, you can protect your kids. So how do you have healthy conversations? And there's age-appropriate tools. National Center of Missing and Exploited Children has great tools. Safe Hope International has good tools. There's so many different.
What would be your main recommendation? Like if I were to pull one tool home, into my household, what would that be?
I think there's so many good ones.
Which is good. I'm glad there's good options out
there. Right. For tools and education. I think National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, I think has NCMEC, N-C-M-E-C.
N-C-M-E-C. Okay.
So National Center of Missing and Exploited Children.
Okay.
They've got great resources for all age groups. And then also National Human Trafficking Hotlines, the second one. Like both of those two.
And does that begin age 3, 4? Do those discussions?
It can start with young, littles through adults. And they've got parent tools. They've got school staff resources. They've got community church resources. They've got different institutions, community groups as well. But for parents, having conversations, one thing is like situational drills. So you have fire safety drills. I don't know if families still do this at home. I've heard from schools that they still do this, but it's like, if your house is on fire and you're in this room, what are your options? What do you do to stay safe? Talking through situations. As a parent, more often than not, your prefrontal cortex is closer to being fully developed than your child's. And so like, how do you help them problem solve? Because there are times when you're talking to your kid and you're like, what were you thinking? And they can honestly say, they weren't. Like their brain was their brain didn't do it because it wasn't designed or hasn't fully developed to do it yet. So, you can walk through those situations with them and work on those drills. So if you're at a sleepover and somebody starts showing you a video and okay, this is content that, whether it's pornographic or it's, things that are making me uncomfortable or scared, what are my options? You could do something like the X text. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but the X text is where you have, whether it's the letter X or a code word with your family, where you text your parent X or your code word like bubbles. And 3 minutes later, you set your phone down. 2 to 3 minutes later, your parent calls and they're like, honey, I'm so sorry. Something came up. I have to pick you up. No, mom, I'm hanging out with my friends. I'm so sorry. It's me. I'm the problem. Hi. Like, I need to pick you up. Mom, you're the worst. And then they get an out where they get to save face with friends.
Yep.
And then you as the parent can pick them up and support them. And I know a lot of parents are like, but we need to intervene all the situations. True. If you can intervene for the children's friends too, great. But the reality is your children also need to have safe options for an escape and to ask them to rat out on their friends. That system, proven so far, has not worked. So making sure that they have escape tools first and foremost, and then addressing with it. So you're at a sleepover, what are your options? If you're on a school bus and somebody shows you something, what are your options? What's the coolest, most competent way you can say no? Or my friends, they all joke I have Ashleyisms. So it's like little messages or phrases that I use a lot.
Yeah.
And you just own it. This is an Ashleyism. Like, it is what it is. I am who I am. It is,
Yeah.
And so how do you build confidence and trust? Or like for parents, well, I don't want my kids, like, which apps are safe and which ones are not. Any app, if it connects you to the internet, can be used. For me, Scrabble, I'm still mad about it. But like, any app can be used if it connects you with another person. And so instead of thinking of what can they use, what they cannot use, think of have your kids show you what matters to them. Like if they're on TikTok, if they're on Snapchat, if they're on Instagram, if they're on some of them on Facebook, if they're on, whatever their social media platforms are, have them walk you through it. Be like, okay, what is this TikTok? Like, and have them show, what do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Okay, let's talk through what are some of the risks and vulnerabilities. If you show a video of yourself, even if it's not sexualized, right? Like you're showing at a hockey game, or if you're showing like people want to be social media influencers, if you're creating content, okay, what are the risks involved? Who can see it? What happens if somebody asks for more content? What happens if somebody's trying to guide you or influence you in that way? What if they're offering money? What if they're offering XYZ? Or it's like if somebody's blackmailing you over sexualized content, like that girl with the 4th grade, if it's what we tell students is that if somebody's messaging you, take a screenshot of it, let them know if my content is not fully deleted from all your devices, I'm taking the screenshot to law enforcement and you can be held liable for sextortion and distribution of child pornography. All of a sudden.
That's a great anecdote.
Right.
There.
Like, and I did not make up this. The experts did. So
that's not an Ashleyism there.
That is not an Ashleyism, but I definitely share that with friends.
Yeah.
But it goes from all of a sudden I'm trapped. I have no way out. Somebody is blackmailing me for $1,000. I'm in 3rd grade. I don't have $1,000, or I'm in 8th grade. Where am I going to get that money? Okay. If somebody's doing that, if they're saying it only through words, you can go to law enforcement and say, this person has content of me on their phone and they have been telling me that they're blackmailing me. I don't have any written proof, but they have it on their phone and I'm uncomfortable. Or I can show the messages of how I sent it. For parents, do not have the sexualized content sent to your phone. A lot of parents are like, well, I want it off my kid's phone. This is a moment where it's not victim blaming, but the actions have consequences. We have to take that actual phone and bring it to law enforcement. Parents, do not send it to your phone to bring your phone to law enforcement because you're technically committing a crime. You're distributing child pornography onto a new device. Take your child's phone. And also you don't want to spread it to lots of different devices and how they're synced up and everything's synced up now. Take your child's device, bring it to law enforcement. And National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, Renee and I were talking about this earlier. And I know Joy McElroy from Cherish All Children with Lutheran Social Services was talking about this for Take It Down. For sextortion situations, if your content is distributed, like that 4th grade girl, or now 6th grade girl, or at the time, where it's online, a lot of kids are like, well, now my image is out there. And now people, anytime somebody's going to look me up, they're going to see that. Take It Down as a program where it will remove from easy access on the internet. Like somebody might have to do a deep, deep dive to find that content on the internet. But the easy searches, it's not going to be something that's going to pop up, which that also gives children a hope for healing in that process where you're not bound to the past. Because the phrase of once it's on the internet, it's always on the internet. Things are so easily accessible. Take It Down removes that easy accessibility to your content. Which,
God bless that organization for being
honestly,
there,
it's amazing. And so it's been exciting. I do like to always preface too, because I've heard a few people share like, it takes everything down. For right now, as the evidence, it's removing the majority or the deep dive. It's taking most of it down. You'd have to do a deep, deep dive to find it. But in case something pops up ever and you're like, I thought it was all down.
So there's a chance it's all down.
Yes.
But
or anytime
for sure,
the image
strong,
pops
strong
up.
majority of it's down.
Right. Yes. So just taking that with a grain of salt too, because I always like good, healthy expectations so that somebody doesn't lose trust in a system because they thought it was one thing when that's the other piece too. So, but the fact that it's taken down the vast majority or the easy access for all intents and purposes, if somebody looks you up, it's gone, which that's amazing. And so, but those situational drills for parents, building trust, inviting your child into the story, create little traditions where you have real talks. And a lot of times avoid eye contact where it's like you do it side by side. So like driving to Dairy Queen or whatever your ice cream provider is, or going for a walk where you're next to each other and can have dialogue, but you're not like gazing into your child's eye and they're like, I'm feeling really intimidated right now to share these vulnerabilities. Side by side conversations to talk through some of these uncomfortable pieces. And then also for parents, own when you don't know something. It is okay not to know every answer. And right now at CAST, we're looking at how to bring together parents and resources because there's a lot of great resources out there and a lot of parents haven't been utilizing them because from what we've gathered so far from surveys and informational interviews, there's a sense of failure where it's like, I feel like I'm just trying to like flounder as a parent to keep afloat and keep everything together. This feels like such a big topic. I don't want to make it worse, so I'm not going to touch it. It is okay not to be perfect, but taking a step and equipping students and equipping children about this in an age-appropriate way, someone's going to connect with them about this. Who's going to control the narrative? Is it you or is it somebody who might want to cause your child harm for their gain? And so stepping in and doing these small conversations. And if you don't know the answer, be like, I don't know. Why don't we go research that together? Or why don't we look it up? And there's so many tools and resources out there, but to have that authenticity and vulnerability with your kids, be like, I'm here for you in your corner. I love you. I think too, for fathers in particular, one thing I've heard from a few of my clients in the past have been, they grew up in a stable home environment, 2-parent household. The material vulnerability wasn't the issue. It was an emotional vulnerability that was exploited and led into them running away with their romantic partner or with their friend group to try to start a new life of independence. And somebody ended up causing either trafficking them or exploiting them in some capacity. But when they were seeking help, they were told, like, my dad always said, like, if anybody hurts my little girl or if anybody hurts my kids, I'm going to kill them. I can definitely appreciate that sentiment, but kids are hearing you say that. It can create a barrier for them seeking help because I've heard from several victim survivors now where they were like, I didn't want my dad to kill so-and-so. And then he's in jail and he was our breadwinner in our family. And then we couldn't pay for rent or we couldn't pay the mortgage. And then my family was going to be homeless and it cycles and spirals out of control.
So if you're a dad, think it, but don't say it.
There. Yeah. So it's something where it's like, what are the messages you're sharing with your children? Is like, I love you. I'm in your corner. I'm here for you. I will believe you. And building that trust as a parent, it can be easy to say, this is how it is. Explain the why and have your child have input where it's like they're pushing back on having their phone in their room as their alarm clock. And you're like, okay, well, statistically, children who have technology outlets in their room at night are more likely to be exposed to predators, whether it's people they're developing relationships with or people in their life that are asking content and they feel safe and secure at night that nobody's awake and knows what's going on. As a parent, I want you to be safe. So that's the reason why I'm saying, I don't think you should have your phone or technology in your room. What are your thoughts? And they're like, well, I won't engage in it. Okay. Walk me through that. How are you not going to engage in it? Can we find a compromise? How do I keep you safe in a way that you feel empowered? Because there have been situations too where parents lay down the law and then their kid has a second cell phone that their friends all bought them so that they could communicate at night, so that they can stay connected with their community. And so how do you build that trust and have their voice heard in this as you give them guidance and as you're parenting them and supporting them too? And so it's one of those things where as a parent, you're kind of like, I've got a lot to do. I've got a lot to manage. I'm trying to craft this human to being a healthy, joyful, contributing member to society, right? And so how do I come alongside that? Have your child speak into it. Have them share their concerns. But that also means you need to be a safe adult to be able to listen. And a lot of kids are afraid of telling their parents, like, I'm going to get in trouble. This is going to be catastrophized, or my dad's going to kill this person, or, my mom's going to disown me, or whatever that looks like. Also, too, maybe a safe adult is someone in their life that isn't directly the parent. And so making sure your kid has 3 to 5 safe adults, not just trusted adults, safe adults, who are people that are going to be in their corner, that will believe them if they come with concerns, that are there to help them without gain or expectation. So it's like a lot of times that could be staff at different institutions where it's like, I'm not getting any benefit, or manipulating you isn't a benefit to me. Like, I'm here to be in your corner to support you. A lot of times for students, that can be school staff and it can be medical providers, but then also equipping your kid to know the difference between a safe and not safe adult. What's the difference between a secret and a surprise? Surprises have end dates, and it can become public knowledge shortly. If somebody's trying to have you keep a secret without an end date, is that a red flag? Is that person a safe adult? So having your kid know who can they go talk to, not just be like, you can go to grandpa, you can go to your stepmom, you can go to this person, because second most common type of trafficker is a family member, and second most common type of exploiter as well. And so it's like, your family might not necessarily be your safe adult, but how do you come up with that list of who's a safe adult that they can talk to and that they know how to ask for help? So those are conversations that parents can do. I don't know if that's a little abstract. Like, yes, you can have those tools and resources, but it's conversation and building trust.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And having it rooted in what is it again?
NCMEC.
NCMEC.
National Center Missing and Exploited Children.
Yeah. So to lean back on that, to where, so parents that are listening, go get that, go get the material from them, and then keep these ideas in mind that you're talking about. Right. Now, what about from the church's perspective, or, from us, we have a school attached with the church, right? So just kind of, what kind of things can we do?
Yeah. I think it's also creating space for conversation about this. And how do you have this in a healthy way? And so when there's prevention education, and also letting students know, where do they go for resources if they need help. And so programs, whether it's Human Trafficking 101 or geared towards students, like youth programs, we've done presentations. There's other groups that do presentations too, but like where the students are like the youth group and Wednesday nights in one room, parents are in another, and we're doing the same education. Equipping youth leaders. How do you come alongside students in a way? I think a lot of times it's that sense of either I want to be a friend, but also how do you support somebody through that? Getting training on that, having these conversations and normalizing the conversation without shame or blame and without pushing people away, but bringing people in. And I think for the church too, there's been that wrestle historically, right? And especially I know this gets a little political, the LGBTQI2S+ community is disproportionately targeted for sex trafficking. A big piece of that, quite a few individuals in that community have been burned by the church and have a reluctance, because it's like, I was rejected. And so then I found people that I thought could give me emotional support or a roof over my head. And then they ended up exploiting. And what does that look like? And so having healthy conversations, healthy resources, healthy outlets for people to be able to be supported so that they don't have those material or emotional vulnerabilities is something the church can do. Also, having financial support too for causes, if that's something where you're doing outreach. Human trafficking and exploitation is all over this planet. It's everywhere. It's also in your backyard. So we're based in Minnesota. Minnesota has active cases of human trafficking in every county. It is something that, and it's urban, suburban, and rural. And the 2019 Minnesota Student Health Survey, when it asked students, have you ever traded your body for something of value? Over 5,000 students said yes. And that was it was proportioned all across the state, but even slightly higher in suburban and rural locations.
Really?
Yes. And so it's something where if you're like, well, it doesn't happen here, it does. And with technology, it makes it even more accessible. And so having these conversations, equipping people with tools and those messages of affirmation, right? You are priceless. Your worth never changes no matter what happens to you. There is we connect with a lot of presentations with churches as well. There's quite a few churches that we've partnered with. CAST is not a faith-based nonprofit. We go based on the evidence too. And we partner with a lot of churches who do Bible studies after that say, here's this information. What does scripture say about it?
Mm-hmm.
That's another tool that a lot of churches have been implementing too, where you get to here's the evidence base of what's going on in our community. What does the word have to say?
Mm-hmm.
So that's another option too. But exploitation thrives in silence, and we have to talk about it. Sharing your time, sharing your resources, sharing your connections. Advocate for these getting into schools, advocate for training to get to youth leaders, to get to ministry staff, to get to parents. When you know what a problem is and you know how to be the solution, that is where you can make change happen.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can end it before it begins, then those who are providing direct client services can get higher quality of care because they don't have a wait list of 80 to 100 people waiting to have a roof over their head because they've been impacted and they're leaving their exploitive situation.
Mm-hmm.
And for somebody who was a caseworker, when I worked 60 to 80 hours a week, and it was like, and just trying to stay afloat with the clients that I had, if we can narrow that funnel, but it starts with conversation and it starts with an openness to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ashley, thank you for all you're doing. Let's take a quick break. And then when we come back, which for those that are listening will be in like 10 seconds right now, right? But we'll have Renee come on as well. And Renee's going to give voice to kind of the other side of things, right? And kind of the rehabilitation side. So there's a couple different avenues for healthy ways forward for dealing with these issues. And we're going to explore a couple more. Let's take a quick
Sounds
break.
great. Thanks.
Mm.